right. Well, hey, to start off this morning, I'm going to say something that, like, everybody is going to agree on this right now. Inflation stinks, right? Like we're all feeling the pinch of that right now. Is that inflation in our country right now? It feels like it's just kind of going crazy, and so you're feeling that at the gas pump, you're feeling that at the grocery store, you're feeling that all kinds of places. I actually heard that credit card companies are actually going to start sending out pre-declined credit cards in the mail because of all the inflation coming, and so like it's just been crazy. I also heard that some big corporations like recently laid off like 25 different congressmen because of inflation, and then it's just the way that things are going. I heard that pictures now are worth 200 words instead of 1,000. I actually heard that the value of your car actually changes if there's a full tank of gas in it or not. So if you're looking to sell a used car, fill it up, it'll help you. Like there's just different things about our economy right now that we know are hard, and it's painful. But one of the great things about inflation is that if you're like super disciplined and you say, you know, I'm not going to change my grocery bill, and you just stick to it, the good news is that all those bags are going to be lighter when you carry them into the house when you get home. So look, inflation is rough, and so yeah, I made a bunch of lame jokes about inflation, and the reason why is because demand has increased following a period of low interest. But it's a thing that we're all dealing with, and a lot of people are feeling the hurt from that right now. It is crazy, and it affects all of us. It affects some people worse than others, depending on your situation in life. For some of you, it's kind of a little bit of a pain. For some of you, it's been catastrophic, and it's been really difficult to deal with. Many people I know have been praying for the economy and for everybody who's been adversely affected because of it. And we've been asking the question is, how can we fight inflation? Well, and maybe the question behind that question is this, is what is it going to take to get God's attention? And what do we have to do to get God's attention to address this? See, that's really that question is, how do I get God's attention? That's the question that we started with in this series, that we ask that question not just about inflation and how things are going there right now, but we ask this about so many different areas in life. God, what's it going to take for you to step in and help my marriage? Or God, what's it going to take for you to heal this relationship? Or God, what's it going to take for you to step into my kid's life? Because I see them beginning to stray down a path that I certainly didn't raise them to go down. And God, what is it going to take to get your attention? God, what's it going to take for you to step into this stressful situation that I've been at work? Or God, what's it going to take for you to bring about this healing that we've been praying for faithfully for so long? How do I get God's attention? And so we started this series last week asking that question. And we looked at a specific verse, and it's a verse that we're going to continue to come back to over and over throughout this series. We looked at 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, and this is what it says. And this is a verse that is familiar, so familiar to many, many Christians. It says this: if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And so it lays out in that verse, it lays out 4 practices that as believers that we are to engage in, that we're supposed to humble ourselves and pray and seek God's face and turn from our wicked ways. And we talked about this last week, is that those 4 practices, it feels like sometimes they seem to be the answer to how do we get God's attention, right? Like it seems to be if we just do these things, God will listen. But as we began to explore last week, we saw that there's a whole lot more to it than that. That it's more than just if you do X, Y, and Z, then God will do this. There's a lot more to it. We talked about how through each of those things, God is looking for both an internal connection to establish with you, but also he's looking for external action. He wants an internal connection, and he wants external action. And so we began talking about those 4 practices last week, and we started with prayer. And we talked about how you will always get what you really want when you pursue connection with God over an outcome from God. That when you pursue a relationship with God, with knowing God above getting him to jump through hoops or to do the specific things that you've been asking for. If you can do that, then you will always get what you really want. And this week, we're going to be looking at a different one. We're going to be talking about the very first one in that list. God tells Solomon, and really he tells all of Israel, to humble themselves. That Hebrew word, humble, it literally means to have to submit. It's an idea of humbling yourself before God, or basically submitting and saying, God, okay, I have to do whatever it is that you say. I have to live in complete submission to you. But it means a little bit more than that. More than 10 times in the Old Testament, that same word is translated as subdue. And it's used to describe what God did to Israel's enemies when they were defeated in battle. That God stepped in and he subdued Israel's enemies. The idea that if you take those two definitions and kind of combine them together, the idea behind humbling ourselves before God is surrender. It's the idea that you give up your claim on a particular outcome in light of who it is you're engaging with. So because you're engaging in relationship with the God of the universe, you let go of the expectations you have for how things will turn out. It's this idea of fighting this inflated sense of self that we all have that says, I'm the only one that really knows what is best for me. Now, this doesn't mean that we get rid of all self-interest. It doesn't mean that all of the desires that we have in life are gone magically or that they're bad in some way. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean that all of those things become secondary to God's leading in our lives. See, I think it's really significant that humility is the first of those 4 practices listed in that verse. It's given kind of a priority, and you'll see as we go through this series the priority that's given. See, the other actions that are mentioned there, praying and seeking God's face and turning from our wicked ways, none of those can really be carried out in a way that truly engages a relationship with God without humility. Humility is kind of the vital ingredient of all of those things that we're to do. Boyd Bailey, he's a Christian leadership coach and author. He says it like this. He says, humility is the gateway to grace. Maybe you could describe it like this. Humility is kind of the low doorway that you have to stoop to go through as you come into the throne room of God. Not just coming into the throne room of God with our requests or our outcomes that we would like to see him bring about, but as we pursue a real connection with him. See, as we engage in that type of relationship with God, humility, as we see, humility doesn't demand, humility doesn't barter, humility doesn't manipulate, humility surrenders. Because it acknowledges that God's ways are always right, no matter if they go the things that I would like them to or not. See, God's character is perfect. God has perfect love and wisdom, which means that he wants to bring about the greatest good for the most people that is possible in any given situation. This theme of humility, having humility, that followers of Jesus, followers of God, have humility. It runs throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, throughout the entire Old Testament. And almost every single time that humility is mentioned throughout the Old Testament, it is used in reference to humbling yourself before God. That is always about humbling yourself before God in almost every situation. And that theme gets picked up again in the New Testament. In the book of James, we looked at this verse last week. James chapter 4, verse 10 says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. See, humility before God is the priority. That's the goal, to be surrendered to him. But it's not the only way that humility shows up in our lives. See, I mentioned just a second ago that in the Old Testament, humility is almost always used in reference to humbling ourselves before God. But there is one exception. There is one time where the idea of humility, of humbling yourself, is used a little bit differently. And it has to do with the benefit that comes along with living humbly amongst other people, living humbly in relationship to other people. The verse is actually found in Proverbs chapter 25, verses 6 and 7, this is what it says. It says, "Do not exalt yourselves in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, 'Come up here,' than for him to humiliate you before his nobles." See, the idea here is that there's a benefit for showing humility around other people. And also, there's a danger in seeking the wrong kind of attention. There's a danger that could lead to embarrassment. Now, we kind of like that idea when it comes to other people. Like when we see other people who are obviously like just seeking attention or seeking prestige or seeking to be elevated, we like to see them get a little embarrassed. Like we like to see them get knocked down a peg or two. But the reality is that each of us is guilty of that sometimes. We like to look at others and say, "Oh, who do they think they are?" But really, this is only a hint about how we should live in humility with others. See, this is talking about a setting where you're in the presence of a king, and you don't want to make yourself out to be more important in front of the king and be embarrassed when he sends you back to your rightful place. That it's better to kind of keep a low profile and allow him to elevate you if he thinks that you're worthy of that. And that gives us one picture of humility. And that's really, like I said, the only picture in the Old Testament of humility and how it is to show up in our lives as it relates to our relationships with other people. We see examples of specific people in the Old Testament who live lives of humility. They live humble lives, but this is the only place where there's specific instruction or encouragement or warning about how we are to show humility in our lives. But it's not surprising that in the New Testament, Jesus, he takes up this theme. He takes up this passage in particular, and he being the master teacher that he is, Jesus, he expands upon it, and he begins to help us see how true humility will show up in our lives as we have relationships with other people. Jesus does this. It's in Luke chapter 14, and that's where we're going to spend the majority of our time this morning. Luke 14. Jesus, he's teaching. He's at a Pharisee's house. And so if you look at chapter 14, verse 1, it specifically says it's a prominent Pharisee's house. So Jesus is at the home of an important religious leader in the community. And he's there, and while he's there, if you see that in verse 1, it says that they were watching him. That the religious leaders who were gathered at this Pharisee's house, they're paying really close attention to Jesus. But Jesus is watching something too. Skip down to verse 7. Luke 14, beginning in verse 7. It says, when he, talking about Jesus, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. And so he touches on a practice that was really common there, that they're picking out their seats at a table. Now, we tend to think of that as like you come in and you look for an empty seat and you sit down. You don't think that that's very much of a big deal. But in Jewish culture, and actually this was more of a Greek culture thing that kind of bled into Jewish culture later, there was a practice where there were very specific seats at a dinner, that if someone was throwing a dinner at their house, having a dinner at their house where they invited a bunch of people, there was a very specific seating arrangement. So at a Jewish meal or a Greek meal, the way the tables would have been arranged, it would have been a little table that's only about 6 inches tall. It's very, very short, and it would have been really 3 tables shaped in kind of a big U. So imagine like one table on this side, one table on this side, and then another one across the middle. And everyone who was sitting at the dinner, they'd all be sitting on one side of the table, and they'd be kind of like laying on the ground, propped up with a pillow like on one elbow. They'd be propped up and eating with the other hand, and that's how they would sit around this table. But like I mentioned, there was a very specific seating arrangement. See the host, the most important person at the dinner, at the banquet, would have sat in the very middle. And so you've got the 2 tables on the side and the one coming across the middle. He would have sat in the very center of that most prominent table. That would have been considered the head of the table. Then immediately to his right is the next most prestigious seat. And so like whoever was the next most important person there would have sat at the right hand of the host. And then the next most important person, so like the number 2, or the number 3, I guess this would be, is sitting directly to their left. And then number 4 is sitting directly to the right of number 1. And you see how it goes, and it alternates from one side to the other all the way down both sides of the table until the least prestigious person who is lucky enough to be invited to this dinner is sitting in the very last seat, the farthest away from the host on the left-hand side. And that's how seating was. And so when it says that Jesus watched them as they picked the places of honor at the table, what's happening is that the people who have been invited to this banquet, they were walking in and they're jockeying for position. They're trying to go, okay, where am I supposed to sit? I mean, I don't want to necessarily take the most prestigious seat because I know I'm probably not that guy, but I don't want to go way down and admit that I'm not supposed to be here almost. And so there's this mental game going on as they're trying to figure out, okay, where should I sit where I look important but maybe not too important. Or probably there's a few people that are like, nope, I get that number 1 seat, or I'm number 1 or number 2, and I know that. And so everyone, as they're coming in, this is what every single person is doing, is they're trying to figure out, where do I fit here? What's my level of prestige? Because the idea is that where you sat indicated a whole lot about you, and it indicated a lot about especially your relationship to that most important person there, that to the host. And so Jesus is watching people come in. He's watching the guests stake out the very best seats. See, it was all a big competition. That when you got together for a dinner like this, it was a big competition amongst the people there to see, okay, where's this going to shake out? Where's everybody going to sit? How are we going to know who's the greatest? And Jesus sees this happening, and he tells a parable. He tells a story with a point. And this is how he goes on. Luke 14, beginning in verse 8. Jesus is speaking. He says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then, humiliated, you'll have to take the least important place. But when you're invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. See, Jesus is pointing out this exactly what this passage from Proverbs that we looked at earlier said. He's pointing out that it's better to assume that you have a lower position than other people and allow the people in charge to place honor on you, to place recognition on you by having you move up into a more prestigious seat. And to be honest, everyone at this dinner who's trying to pick out their seats, trying to get that position of honor, everyone there should have known this. See, this is a gathering of religious people, specifically religious leaders. They should have immediately recognized when Jesus starts telling this story that he's drawing on this from Proverbs 25. He's drawing on this from the wisdom literature that they have spent their entire lives studying. They knew better. That as soon as Jesus starts talking and telling this parable, their minds are immediately going to that passage in Proverbs that they looked at, and they all know immediately, we weren't doing what we probably should have been. They knew better. And honestly, so do we. We know better. We know this, that even if we fall into situations in life where we may be seeking prestige, or we may be seeking approval from somebody else, or we may be seeking compliments, or whatever it might be, we all tend to appreciate the people who don't do that. That there's something in us that intuitively, when we see people who we know are worthy of honor, that they've maybe accomplished something, or their character speaks of them in a certain way, like when we see certain people who don't elevate themselves, we appreciate that. And we like that. But we also know that type of humility can be faked. See, false humility is another thing that really drives us nuts. If we don't like it when people are really thirsty for attention and trying to draw the attention and the prestige and the honor toward themselves, we don't like that. But we really don't like it when somebody is faking their humility. Things like when people give humble brags, they say things like, maybe they're talking about their kids and they're like, oh, it's going to be so hard for her to choose a college because she's got all A's, so she's got so many options. They're saying it as it's a difficult thing, but really it's an opportunity to kind of brag a little bit. Or maybe they say something like, "Oh, it's so awful having such a big house. You're so lucky you don't have this many rooms to clean." Like it sounds like they're trying to make it sound like things are hard, but when in reality they're like, "Nah, things are pretty great, and I'm sorry for you." Or maybe you've seen people do this where they publicize the sacrifices that they've made in order to impress other people. Like maybe it was a legitimate sacrifice that they gave something up, and they maybe they gave up a career path, or maybe they gave up money or a job, or maybe they gave up time with their kids or whatever it was, but they let you know about it all the time. Like, I'm so glad that I made the decision to stay home and not make as much money. And they continually are just kind of pointing out the sacrifices that they've made, and so over time it kind of makes you feel like, I don't really care as much that you've made that sacrifice. Or maybe, this one's me, people who enjoy debate over dialogue. Like where maybe you just get caught up in, or people who get caught up in like, I want to have a debate, I want to prove my side, I want to be right, but I don't necessarily want you to point out how I might be wrong, and if you point it out, I really don't want to actually give serious consideration to it. I struggle with that one. Or maybe false humility shows up like this, that you only admit small sins, but you ignore the big ones. Like when you're in a situation, maybe it's church, maybe it's small group, that you're willing to talk about, I covet sometimes. Sometimes I want things that, aren't mine. But you won't talk about some of the other sins that are behind the scenes because you know that maybe they're a little bit more shameful. And you're afraid that people will judge you. And so you let people know about the little ones, but we don't talk about the bigger ones. Really what that is image control. You want people to know that, yes, I'm a sinner just like all of you, but I'm not that bad. Or maybe false humility shows up like listening to people, not to like listen to them and to provide support, but so that you can have the opportunity when they're done talking to speak life into them unsolicited. And you want to tell them, like, because I know the solution to your problem, and you want to fix all of their problems. Or maybe when you think of false humility, you think of people who can't laugh at themselves when other people are the ones making the joke. Or maybe somebody who uses a humble tone of voice while they say proud things. Maybe the most common example among Christians of false humility is the person who refuses to allow any honor to be given to them at all. That's false humility. It's a subtle, or at least we'd like to think that it's subtle when we do it, but it's a way of exalting ourselves. Of like trying to take the back door to honor and saying, you know what, I'm not going to like overtly try to promote myself and lift myself up and make myself look great in front of people. I'm gonna try to make myself look low, but in reality what I'm hoping is that everyone else will notice and will lift me up, will give me that praise and that recognition. It's trying to get people to notice how humble we are, which is actually the opposite of true humility. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, he describes how you will know when you've truly met a humble person. It's probably not what you expect. This is what he said. He said, "Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who's always telling you that of course he is nobody. Probably all you'll think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it'll be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life too easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking of himself at all. There's absolutely no comparison going on. There's no I'm better than anyone. There's no I'm worse than anyone. It is just someone who is humble. Jesus summarizes this. He summarizes it all in a statement that really sums up his teaching. Honestly, if you could memorize this verse, if there's any verse from what we're looking at today that if you want to understand the idea behind humility, this is the verse to remember. It's Luke chapter 14, verse 11. Jesus says, "For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." He doesn't say that those who exalt themselves will be exalted because they exalted themselves. He says, no, actually the opposite's going to happen. It is that when you're thirsty for that attention and for that applause and for that recognition and for that prestige and you're eager for the thank you, that's when you'll be brought low. But then the second half of that verse, those who humble themselves will be exalted. Not those who have that false humility that says, oh, I'm horrible. Not that. But people who just don't elevate themselves, who remain humble, who humble themselves, they will be exalted. To be exalted means you're exalted by someone else, not on your own. But then Jesus goes on. And he continues teachings. Like everything that he has said so far basically summarizes those verses from Proverbs that those religious teachers who are at the dinner would have been completely familiar with. And they would have been nodding along yep, he's right. Yeah, he's right. They would have been a little embarrassed, oh, look at us. We were all jockeying for position. But they would have agreed with what he's saying so far. But then Jesus does what Jesus does. And he gets to a point behind the point. He takes what they were all familiar with. He takes this biblical principle that they have built their lives around, hopefully, and he expands it. He opens it up to expose a little bit deeper application to say, look, this is what it should really look like as you live it out in your life. He opens up this wider application of the principle. See, humility is easy to fake. We've talked about that. So here's how you can really spot a truly humble person. You spot it by what they do when they are the person in the place of honor, or when they're the person in the place of power or influence. You spot it by what they do when they're the host of the dinner. Jesus goes on, verse 12. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid." Now, I gotta clarify something real quick. Jesus isn't saying you shouldn't have friends over. You should only invite over, the people that you don't know who are in difficult situations. He's not saying that, but he's saying just recognize when that's all you surround yourself with, when you're in the position of having the influence and you're in the position of making the decisions, and you make those decisions only always on behalf of the people that you love and you care about, then your kindness and your generosity towards them will likely be returned someday. And that sounds really great. I would like to have some of the nice things I've done for people returned. That sounds pretty great. I would love that. But Jesus is highlighting, it's true humility doesn't only invest in relationships that are mutually beneficial. He goes on, verse 13. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Basically, invite a whole bunch of people who can never pay you back. Those people, most likely, all of those different groups that he listed there, they represent people who have been kind of pushed to the margins of society. And the point that Jesus is making here is that, look, true humility looks like compassion, not comparison. That all you guys, when you showed up at the dinner today, you came in and you were all comparing. You were sizing each other up, trying to figure out where everybody fits. That's not humility. Humility doesn't compare. Humility looks like compassion. Those with true humility leverage any honor or any power or any prestige or any influence that they have to draw attention not to themselves, but to elevate the dignity and the status of others, and in this example, specifically, by meeting the physical needs of those who can never return the favor. But honestly, even this can be faked. Like, people can do what Jesus has said here for all of the wrong reasons. They can do it to try and attract, people who think that they're awesome or think that they're so great, they're so nice, they're so kind. We can do that. We know that. You've seen that before. Maybe you've done that before. It can be faked, and that's why I believe that of those 4 practices of humbling ourselves before God and praying and seeking God's face and turning from our wicked ways, that's why I believe humility is listed first. Is that we are to humble ourselves before God, that we are to prioritize humbling ourselves primarily before God, and when we do that, it will spill over in humility towards others. So how do you know? How do you know if you've really humbled yourself before God first, that you've really put Him first, that He is the motivation for why you do anything as far as exercising humility towards other people? How do you know? Well, look at what Jesus says will happen when we use our position and our influence to meet the needs of those who can never pay us back. Verse 14. So, verse 13. You have a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. See, another thing about humility, about true humility, is it's okay with delayed rewards. It's okay with not getting a thank you. It is okay with waiting until the second coming of Jesus to see what rewards will be given. See, all this talk about having humility toward other people, honestly, it can feel like a little bit of a trap. It can feel like one of those things for believers, like, I know that I'm supposed to do this, and so I'm going to try my hardest, and I'm going to do everything I can to be humble towards people. I know I want to be careful. I don't want to slip into false humility, but I probably will at some point. And I don't want to have my efforts to be humble actually be just a way for me to, basically employ attention-seeking behavior. I don't want my humble acts or my attempts at being humble, I don't want that to show up as really just seeking praise from other people, whether that's seeking praise from God or seeking praise from people. I don't want it to turn into, look at me, I'm so great. And so how do we avoid that? Because it's within all of us. We've all experienced it before. We've all done that. We will all probably do it again. So how do we avoid it? Because it feels like a trap. It feels like I'm supposed to act in this way, but when I act in this way, how do I keep my motives from like sneaking in the back door and really corrupting things? The good news is that actually the pressure's off you on that for that. Like, do we tend to think, okay, I've got to do this and I've got to act a certain way and clean myself up and I got to do it for the right reasons and all these different things. Actually, the pressure's not on you. Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, very familiar passage for many of you. It talks about these things called the fruit of the Spirit. And it talks about this as fruit, characteristics that show up in a believer's life as they are submitted to God. And this is what it says, Galatians 5:22, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. That word gentleness, it's also the Greek word for humility. And because this is a fruit not of you, it's not something that you produce, this is the fruit of the Spirit, it means that humility is grown by God, not given to Him. Humility is something that God develops within you. It's not a gift that you offer to Him. That as you continue to humble yourself before God, His Spirit living in you does the work of forming you into a person who lives out community in their day-to-day relationships. It's His work, not ours. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't try practicing humility in life. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to be humble when we have the opportunity. It just means that we need to recognize where that humility comes from in the first place. That the outworking of humility in your life is the direct fruit, it's the direct result of God's saving and cleansing and sanctifying work in you. But in order for Him to do that work, God is not going to force a relationship that you do not truly want. God cannot be fooled by your false humility. You may fool everyone else. You cannot fool God with your false humility. He knows the difference between your attention-seeking behavior and a life that has truly loosened its grip on what I think is best for me. We'll finish with James 4:10. That verse that we talked about last week, that we referenced earlier this morning. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and He will lift you up. You will always get what you really want when you pursue connection with God over an outcome from God. So maybe for you this morning, it's time. It's time for you to humble yourself before God. For some of you, maybe it's the first time that you've humbled yourself before God, and that first step that you need to take is submitting to Him in baptism. To say very clearly, okay, God, you have said that this is what you want your followers to do, that's how we begin our relationship with you. This is how we identify ourselves as followers of you for the very first time, and so I need to do that. And so maybe you need to begin to explore that idea of being baptized. I would love to talk to you about that this morning. As we wrap up this morning and we sing a song as we conclude our service, if that's you today, I'd love to talk with you. Come, I'll be standing in the back by the doors. Come talk to me. Tell me your story. Or maybe it's not baptism. Maybe it's not a first step. Maybe it's a return step. Maybe that for so long in life you've been going a different way, and it's time to humble yourself and to stoop through that door as you go into the throne room again and to say, God, I'm here, and you're king, and I'm not. Maybe it's time for you to seek His face, and we'll talk about what that means next week. Maybe it's time for you to passionately pursue an intimate knowledge of God, of who He is, what His character is like. Not just that He died for your sins, but why? Who is He? What would motivate Him to offer Himself for you? You will always get what you really want when you pursue connection with God over an outcome from God. Let's pray together. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for your goodness to each of us. God, thank you for your love and your grace. God, thank you for the humility you showed when you went to the cross and you accepted the most humiliating death that was possible. And God, you accepted all the pain and the degradation and the jeers and all of it. God, you took it on our behalf. God, help us to be devoted to you. God, help us to humble ourselves before you, to acknowledge that you are the director of our lives. That God, you're the boss, you're the king. And God, may our humility before you translate into humility in our relationships with others. May we not think more highly of ourselves than we really are, but may we prioritize the needs of the people that we love, but also the people who can never pay us back. Father, we love you. In Jesus' name we